Hey everyone, welcome back. This is part two on our lecture about emotions. We're going to be talking about interpreting emotions. So, if you've not yet watched the lecture on emotional expression, I would make sure that you watch that one first. There are parts of this that'll just make more sense if you've already been exposed to that other lecture. So, let's get into this idea of interpreting emotions. Now, this slide is arguably one of the kind of the most complicated slides we talk about in all of AP Psych. Like this is up here in my mind with talking about neurotransmission and the depolarization of neurons. I think that this is one of those slides that just it takes a little bit of time to digest. So put a star next to it, highlight it, because what we're doing with this slide is we're going to talk about three main theories in regard to how we experience emotions. Now, these theories are going to go in kind of a chronological order, starting with the one of the first theories, theory one, and this is a very historical theory, and then working our way up to a more modern understanding of how we experience emotion. Okay, and so all three theories, I'm going to use the same example of how do we get from a stimulus to an emotion. And the stimulus in this case is going to be an oncoming car. So you're driving home from school, and maybe a car kind of crosses the median in the highway and is barreling towards you, and then you experience the emotion of fear, right? As you likely would. How do we get from the stimulus of an oncoming car to the emotion of fear? Well, this first theory, we got to back up about 120 years, and this is going to be known as the James Longae theory. Now, the James Longae theory works like this. According to this theory, you have some particular stimulus, an oncoming car, that is going to produce a physiological response, right? And we're talking about a physiological response. We're talking about what does it do primarily to your nervous system, right? What happens to your heart rate, for example? It's going to start beating widely. And so you have this physiological response, and each and every emotion that you and I experience has a different physiological response. And so when that car is barreling towards you and your heart starts to race and your pupils dilate and you start to sweat, then your brain will interpret that as I am afraid. That is the James Longae theory. And it might seem a little backwards, a little different, right? I'm going to back this up just for a moment. Look at our quote here. We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble. That's William James, the James Longae theory. Normally, we would think, well, if I'm frightened, then I will start to tremble. Or if I am angry, I will then lash out. If I am sad, then I may begin to cry. And James says it's the other way around, that you have the stimulus, which produces physiological response, which then leads to an emotion. Now, some psychologists were curious about if this was true. Is it true that every emotion we have has a very different, unique physiological response? And so they set up this really interesting experiment to try to test if this was in fact the case. So, kind of bear with me as I explain this experiment with you. They brought participants in to view some kind of film, a movie, and there were four different rooms. In one room, people were watching a movie that was really funny, right? So some comedy and they're laughing and having a great time. The second movie was a horror film and they were showing something that was quite frightening for the viewers. The third film was a documentary that was meant to anger them. So it was over a very sensitive topic. Think, clubbing baby seals or something that just makes you very, very mad. And then the fourth film was an erotic film that made them sexually aroused. And all of the participants were hooked up to what we call a biofeedback machine. And so these are machines, again, we talked about this, that kind of monitor our heart rate, monitor our breathing, how much we sweat, that kind of stuff. And in a completely separate room, psychologists are looking at all of this feedback to the people's biology and what's happening with their body. Now, you would think that if all of our emotions produced very unique, specialized physiological responses, then a psychologist should be able to look at a readout and say, I can tell that this person is angry, or I can tell that this person is happy, or I can tell that this person is frightened. But not only could they not connect the physiological response to any particular emotion, They couldn't even differentiate people. They couldn't even put them in groups. They couldn't even say, well, subject A and subject B were clearly in the same room, but I just don't know which room they were in. They couldn't even do that because the reality is when we are frightened, when we are angry, when we are aroused, or when we are happy, our body tends to kind of do the same thing. So our physiological responses don't really appear to be so unique that we could then interpret them as separate emotions. So it seems like the James Longae theory isn't exactly correct. So when we go to this second theory is what we call the Canon Barred theory of emotion. And the idea behind Canon Barred is that when you have some stimulus, again, an oncoming car, that stimulus is going to go to a couple different parts of the brain. Part of that stimulus is going to go to subcortical structures and is going to lead to the physiological response, right? The oncoming car and your heart starts to beat very fast. And it will simultaneously also go to your cortex, where it will be interpreted as a particular emotion. I am afraid. In other words, when you have that oncoming car, that stimulus, the physiological response and the emotion will happen simultaneously and separately. One does not influence the other, according to Canon Bard. They happen simultaneously and separately. Well, there appears to be a problem with this as well. Because if in fact the physiological response and the emotion are happening separately from one another, then we should be able to manipulate one of these and see no impact on the other one. And the reality is that's not true. Psychologists can manipulate, for example, your physiological response, and it does impact the emotion that you experience. Psychologists can give you certain drugs, for example, that calm the body down, that slow the heart rate, and sure enough, the emotion will calm. Or we can do the opposite. Psychologists have injected people with adrenaline and then monitored their emotions. And sure enough, they find that if we accelerate that heart rate, if we release adrenaline into the bloodstream, these people are more likely to become irritated, agitated, worked up, and things like that. So the idea that your physiological response and your emotions happen simultaneously and separately also doesn't seem to be true. So that leads us to our third theory of emotion. And the third theory is a mouthful. It's what we call the Shakhtar Singer two-factor theory. And I have seen it written as the Shakhtar Singer theory, the two-factor theory, or the whole kit and caboodle, Shakhtar Singer two-factor theory. So you kind of need to know just the whole thing. And this is how it works. The idea behind the two-factor theory is you have some stimulus, in this case, an oncoming car. And the oncoming car is going to produce some kind of physiological response, an accelerated heart rate. So far, this sounds like William James. The difference is the second factor, two-factor theory. In addition to that physiological response, there's a cognitive element, what we call a cognitive label, or sometimes we call it a cognitive appraisal. With a label or an appraisal, you are thinking about that physiological response, and you put these together to then create the emotion. Now, a cognitive label doesn't have to be this deep reflection that takes 2 or 3 minutes. It can happen in a fraction of a second. Your heart rate is pounding, and you think it's pounding because I'm afraid. And then the emotion is fear, right? But you need that second factor. Think of it as like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. If you got a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you need both the peanut butter and the jelly, or you get a different sandwich, right? If you substitute the jelly for honey or the peanut butter for almond butter, you're going to get a different sandwich. Well, the same thing happens with the two-factor theory. If either of these factors change, the physiological arousal or the cognitive appraisal, you get a different emotion. And what I'm getting to here is this idea of the spillover effect. So imagine for a moment you're on a roller coaster, okay? You're on a roller coaster and you're going up and down hills and going loop-de-loops and all that fun stuff, and your heart is pounding out of your chest and your pupils are dilated and you're all worked up and you're frightened because you're on this roller coaster. Well, when the roller coaster comes to a stop and you step off the roller coaster, it's not like all of a sudden your body immediately goes back to normal. You still have this heightened state of arousal. What can happen though is you can then change the appraisal. Before, your heart was pounding because you were afraid. But when you step off the roller coaster and your heart's pounding, now you're laughing and going crazy because you're having so much fun. Your heart is accelerated. And so now you're experiencing extreme joy. In fact, researchers even studied people who were walking off roller coasters and had them rate how attractive someone was, and were more likely to find people attractive after riding a roller coaster. Why? Well, the theory is the spillover effect because your heart's already pounding out of your chest. Maybe it's pounding out of your chest because you're looking at some good looking person. So, some dating advice, if you're looking for some place to take someone on a date, take them out to Worlds of Fun, ride some roller coasters. They'll fall madly in love with you because they think you're the most beautiful person on the planet. It's the spillover effect. They're changing the cognitive label of their beating heart of being afraid to their beating heart looking at you. Now let's look at a few specific emotions and kind of how that interpretation works. So we're going to look briefly at this idea of the interpretation of anger. Of all the universal emotions that we discussed in our earlier lecture, we detect anger faster than any other emotion. So, if we're talking about the emotions of disgust and shock and sadness, happiness, anger is the one that we can pick up very, very quickly. And this is based off survival. You might recall my analogy is of if someone is running towards you and they have an angry face, we need to be able to run away from that person. They might be a threat to us. And so we pick up on anger for survival reasons. We need to very quickly recognize if this is a dangerous situation. And psychologists have studied this, and I attempt to do this on the computer. Frankly, it doesn't work very well. But I'm going to try to show you kind of what this looks like. Psychologists have flashed images of faces on a screen, and they use a touch screen, and you just quickly touch the face that doesn't fit, right? And so most of the faces you'll see have no emotion at all, but some of them will be happy faces or angry faces. And time again, we are able to detect an angry face before we can detect a happy face. And so you look at, here's my mouse here. You look at this here, and you can see two different examples, kind of the example on the left and the example on the right. People can very quickly detect that angry face because the angry face might try to hurt you, as opposed to some of the other emotions. When it comes to interpreting fear, there's some interesting research done by a guy named Richard Lazarus. And Lazarus is going to say that depending on the fear stimuli, it takes some different paths in our brain. Some fears we experience very, very quickly. Other fears, on the other hand, it takes time to develop. And so some fears require more rational thought when thinking, like, is this something that I should be afraid of? Let me give you two examples. If you are walking home late one night from work and it's dark outside, and all of a sudden a car jumps off of the road and is now on the sidewalk coming towards you, you are going to become frightened very, very quickly. And Lazarus would say that this type of fear, which happens very quickly, takes what's called a low road through the brain. That stimulus will enter into your brain. It'll go to your thalamus. Remember, thalamus is what directs information where to go. And that information will be sent immediately to the amygdala, interpreted as fear so that you can respond accordingly because you need to get out of the way right away. Second scenario starts the same way. You're walking home from work, it's dark, it's late at night. But now with this situation, you look over and there's a shadowy figure on the other side of the street. And as you're walking, you're kind of looking at him, and then this shadowy figure starts to cross the street. And now they're kind of behind you and they're walking in the same direction as you, and maybe starting to close the gap between you and this kind of shadowy figure. Well, with this type of fear, it takes a high road. And this type of fear goes to the thalamus, and then it's going to be sent to the cortex for interpretation. And you start to think, what's going on here? Why is this person crossing the road? Why are they walking behind me? Why are they starting to kind of close the gap? And you realize, you know what, this is kind of a freaky situation. I think I'm getting frightened. It takes a little bit longer for you to interpret that type of fear. It takes the high, more conscious road, right? It still occurs, but it doesn't skip this conscious thought required to then experience that fear. And so when you think about the different fears that we have, sometimes that high road allows us to um, eliminate fears. Right now, as I'm giving this lecture, if I were to look over and see a spider 20 feet away from me, my initial thought might be, that's frightening, right? That's low road. I see the spider and I'm frightened. And Lazarus would say, because that takes the low road through my brain. But as I continue to think about it and I allow for conscious interpretation, I can realize that spider's far away. It's going to take a while before it gets to me. And also, I'm a lot bigger and I can just step on it and squash it if I want to. So when that stimulus goes through the high road, through conscious thought, I realize maybe it's not that scary. As far as interpreting happiness, I'll be honest, this slide's pretty straightforward. Your book goes into a lot of detail about the importance of experiencing happiness. Most of this is pretty self explanatory. You can kind of pause it here and look at these things, and I imagine you would be able to predict, for example, that happier people are more optimistic and they have higher self esteem and things like that. The one thing on this slide that may not be common sense is this idea of what we call the feel good, do good phenomenon. You probably know this, you probably just didn't know the name of it. Think about when you need to ask a favor of a parent. Well, you know, it's probably best to ask them that favor when they're in a good mood. Because when we feel good, we're more likely to do good. We're more likely to help others and go out of our way and be altruistic when we ourselves are happy. If you try to ask a favor of your parents when they're in a really crummy mood, it's probably not going to go over very well, right? That's the idea of the feel good, do good phenomenon. Also, in regard to happiness, there are some other factors that can play in. When we're looking at kind of the stimuli that can produce happiness, there are some things to consider. So, I want you to imagine, right? The year is 1998, and I have just received my first cell phone. It's amazing. And the reality is, this Nokia cell phone brought me great joy. I was really, really excited because previous to that, I didn't have a phone. Now, this was a very specific type of phone. I could only call my parents in emergencies, and I had to use it, after 9 p.m. or on the weekends if I was going to call someone else. Otherwise, it was really, really expensive. Give it a few weeks, and that phone didn't bring me the same joy anymore. And this happens to you, right? You get a new video game, or you get a new book that you enjoy reading, or whatever it may be, and when you first get it you're really excited, and then over time, those emotions kind of start to fade. We don't experience polarized emotions for too long, for better or for worse. And this is the idea of adaptation level phenomenon. Our emotions are going to level out. We continually will compare our emotion to what we were previously or what we had previously, and then they level back out. And so if something makes you really excited and happy today, that's great. It's probably not going to last forever. You'll go back to feeling quite normal about it. And that's good news when we start thinking about negative emotions, right? If something happens that bums you out, well, you fail a test or something, you're going to be pretty upset about it today. You're going to get over it, right? That's the idea of emotions will level out. And then the idea of comparison, or what we call relative deprivation. Really interesting how one stimulus can produce very different responses as soon as we start to compare that stimulus to someone or something else. And so maybe you're really excited about your phone until you see that your friend has a newer phone. And then all of a sudden you're like, "Oh shoot, I don't like my phone as much." Or maybe you took that really hard test and you got a 80% on it and you were pretty happy because it was a tough test. And then you look over at your friend and your friend got a 90%. And now your 80% feels worse. You're like, well, shoot, you were happy with it, but now you're not. This is the idea of relative deprivation. We have this bad habit of comparing ourselves to other people. And unfortunately, the result is we often compare ourselves to people that are either like kind of at our level or maybe even a little bit above our level. And the result is it makes us feel unhappy. And last slide for this lecture is this idea of emotional intelligence, our ability to pick up on other people's emotions. Are they being honest and genuine with us? How will their emotions change given this particular situation? This all deals with the idea of emotional intelligence. Can we perceive other people's emotions? Can we understand and predict when their emotions will change? And there's been some studies looking at, are women more emotionally intelligent than men? And the reality is, yeah, they tend to be more emotionally intelligent. Women, for example, are better at picking up whether or not someone is being genuine with their emotions. And so, if my wife comes home and from work, she goes, "How you doing?" I'm going, "Yeah, I'm doing pretty good." She knows if I'm being honest with her or not, right? She has this emotional intelligence. She can pick up if I'm being genuine. Well, how do you really feel? The ability to recognize the relationships between people and detecting, are these people, are they in a genuine relationship? Interesting psychological study done where they had couples just interacting and having a conversation with one another, and then participants were asked, was this an actual couple Or were these two actors pretending to be a couple? And sure enough, time and time again, women were better at detecting whether or not it was a genuine couple or there were two actors just pretending to be a couple. They looked at still images of a supervisor and a supervisee, right? An employer and employee, and they were asked who's in charge in this situation. And time again, women were better at detecting at who was in charge in the particular situation. And then finally, this idea of empathy, and we've talked about empathy before. Empathy is not the same thing as sympathy. The idea of empathy is, can you really put yourself in the shoes of another person, right? Can you experience and feel the emotions of someone else? Can you truly identify with them? And we have found that on average, women tend to be more empathetic than men. And so, again, I'm using her a lot in this lecture as an example, but if I'm watching a movie and it's a sad movie, I might look over and my wife's crying and I'm saying, well, it's just a movie. What's going on? And she's like, no, it's real. And she can really feel those emotions. We would say she's more empathetic than I am. And so, an interesting kind of look at emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, use, understand, and manage our emotions. All right, lots of info in this lecture. Make sure you work through it with those terms, especially those different theories at the beginning. Those can be a little tricky. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out to me. As always, everyone, good luck.